Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have been informed that I do, in fact, actually have ladies in the audience, which very, very big surprise to me, but glad to have you here. Tonight, I am joined by my good buddy, Lambda. How's it going?
Hey, I'm doing very well, thank you. Couldn't think of a better use of an evening than chilling out with you here on your channel. It's going to be a good one.
Excellent. Well, we're very happy to have you. And for those who do not know, Lambda is the host and creator of Lambda Bible Studies, and that is at every Saturday night at 8 p.m. GMT. And we just sort of pick a chapter of the Bible and reread it together. And I usually attend when I can, unless the wife needs extra attention or we have some plans.
Patriarch, if you pick a random episode to listen to, you've got a 95% chance of getting Mr. Patriarch. And if you don't find him on there, then feel free to just skip, because it's usually a second-rate episode.
Yeah, definitely. But anyways, looking forward to a nice Easter weekend, and it is also April 1st, so April Fool's. So the saddest joke of all comes from a comment when I advertised this stream. I said Lambda and I are going to be discussing the spiritual state of England, and someone commented, "To be real easy, there is no spiritual state of England." April Fool's stream, guys. It's over.
I can see where that was going. Yeah, it's going to be a short stream, guys.
Right. Short stream. But so tonight I figured it would. So as you guys are probably aware, I myself am a Christian, and so too is Lambda. And we both consider Christianity to be sort of the true faith, and in addition to being sort of the ancestral sort of religion of the UK, of the West more broadly. And its degradation is really kind of, I would say, sort of the root cause for a lot of the troubles we find ourselves in. And I've only been in Manchester for a few days, so my pulse my pulse on the goings on in England is not as strong as.
How did you find Manchester?
It was all right. It wasn't bad. I was at the time. I was. The way it happened was I was going to visit Eastern and Central Europe for a month, and then my brother bailed on me, and then I met my wife online, so I just tacked South Africa on the itinerary. But my whole plan was to go to Hungary and Slovakia and the Czech Republic, which I did, and I stopped at Manchester on my way in there, both on my way in and out, and I was like, you know what? I'm in England. Let's just walk around a little bit, spend a night. Okay. And it wasn't bad. I didn't really know what to expect. It seemed better than London just because it was less megapolis. But aside from that, I don't really have much to say.
I'm always curious what an outsider would think of England. Clearly, it's where I've grown up, and it's difficult to have that outsider's perspective. I did live in Australia for a little bit. So when I came back after that, I got to see England with fresh eyes to some degree. And you start noticing a few things that aren't universal. But at this point, I'm so fully acclimatized again that sometimes I forget the rest of the world exists.
Yeah. No, that's true what you say, though. Like, once you leave the country of your birth for a period of time, and then you come back, the things that sort of set it apart really begin to stick out to you in a way that wasn't true before. Like, that was certainly the case when I moved to South Africa, and then I go back to Alaska, and I'm just like, wow, this is a totally different world.
Yeah.
And even the rest of the United States, I go down to visit my family in some of my family in Nevada, or visit my aunt in California. And then I go back to Alaska, and it's just the boonies. And I'm like, like my experience is definitely not the rest of the world's. But anyways, speak on topic. This is a bit more relaxed and informal, if you guys can't tell. So, but anyways,
and let's discuss the spiritual state of the country.
Yeah,
Someone in
yeah.
the chat saying this is either going to be super depressing or motivating if we can find any silver linings. So let's try and find a middle ground.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to start off depressing, and then hopefully by the end of it, the Lord gives us a spirit of hope. So that's what we're shooting for. All right. So the first question I have for Lambda, straight up, what is the current state of Christendom in England? Take it away.
Yeah. So yeah, when you originally suggested this stream, I was initially quite overwhelmed by needing to address such a massive topic, and a topic in some ways that's not only vast in scope but quite difficult to answer to even start, because there's so many people. It's difficult to quite analyze the spiritual state of any of the individuals, let alone to get an aggregate idea. But I think it's fair to say that the UK has a strong Christian tradition and is turning increasingly secular. The current, so I thought a really good place to start to get an idea of what's going on is, I think it was Tear Fund did this survey, and they found that about 2/3 of people in the UK have no connection to any church at all. And of those, it was about equally split between those who had once had a connection with a church and had lost it, and those who never had. So that sort of divides the population into three equally sized groups. Those who still have some kind of a connection to church, those who used to and have lost it, and those who never did. Now, I would say amongst those who still say they have a connection with the church, there's still some amount of them who are visiting, say, once a year on Christmas, or even if they're visiting more regularly, their interest is not really spirituality.
Yeah.
They're visiting for another reason. I suppose you could argue in the other two groups, there's people who are spiritual, but the expression of their spirituality is not within Christendom. But I think for the sake of this stream, we're probably talking about Christian spirituality. There's clearly a reduction in nominalism, which is worth noting, and that may be where some of our more positive thoughts towards the end of the stream come from. I think that there's a lot of, in England, there's a lot of history of people who go to church because it's the culturally accepted thing to do. Once upon a time, there was even people who would lose their jobs if they didn't attend church. It's still the case that people go along to church in order to get their children into the right boarding school. Often the best boarding schools are those that are Catholic or whatever. People have the habit of going to church, and after COVID, if things do open up again, I suspect there'll be lower church attendance because people will have lost the habit. But that will probably reinvigorate those congregations with an increased fervor. The people who are there because they really believe in Christianity, rather than just having found their way into a social club. There you go. That's my opening for 10.
All right, cool.
Lay out the broad strokes.
I would say that seems right to me. Here in my country, where the country I live,
South Africa.
Yeah, South Africa. It's different. So out in the rural areas, people are much more religious. There's like, I mean, try and find a black or a colored atheist. There's not many.
Right.
And for the audience, yes, colored is not a slur. It means basically mestizo here. And that is still the case even in sort of the urban areas. But the problem that you have there is you have a lot of falling away. So people won't be atheists or whatever. They'll just sort of, they'll just struggle with faith in some sort of way. But churches now are open, and they have been for a time, at lower capacity due to social distancing requirements and stuff. But the people who have come back are sort of the either the diehards or the people who have, or like a lot of the old ladies whose social groups also are at church, So I think they're really interested in that particular aspect. But so I think the lockdown has had probably a negative impact on it. And one of the things that my buddies, my more reactionary buddies, and I, one of the things I hear them ragging on a lot is the spinelessness of some of the churches here, like kissing the ring of the ANC and being like, oh, thank you for letting us, worship the Lord. And again, it's so nice. We have the greatest president in the world. Thank you. So there's just I think the problem here, and probably also in the UK, is there's a lack of what you might call zealousness, like in the true sense of the word. So a real fervent, like if people really believed that Jesus Christ was the Lord and Savior, and that, they were going to take precautions, but, they believe that whatever, the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ and it will heal them and whatnot, sort of that pre-modern certainty, then I think we'd be looking at a very different sort of outlook from the churches. And, some churches have stood up. I know in the United States, there's been a few who, as examples, who are just, not going to comply. And I know some of the Eastern Orthodox bishops have been kind of outspoken about some of the strictures and stuff. But generally speaking, across denominations, there's sort of a willingness to kind of go along with the status quo. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe that's an interesting diversion to go into the response of different churches to the lockdowns, and possibly just to start with, it's worth explaining where we're coming from, which I'm sure most of your viewers would be aware. But I think that that a local church has a requirement to meet together from the Bible. So you were talking about measuring zeal. It seems like at the moment there's been a confrontation between the authority of the Bible and the pressure from the state. And I've personally been quite disappointed that churches have largely been unprepared to stand up against the sort of secular morality and say, actually, we disagree with the government, we disagree with popular sentiment. Generally, most of the churches have sort of sat on their hands and said, well, we'll assume it's temporary, and here we are a year later still waiting. Now, I know this is mostly about England. In Scotland, they had it stricter. They basically haven't had the churches open for pretty much a year, and that's actually they took I believe the Scottish Parliament to court and won. So they had a bit of a success up there. England took more of a line that you're allowed to meet, but you're only allowed to meet in order to sort of sit silently, receive the Eucharist, and some, listen to some speaking or music or whatever, but not really participate. Which, in my opinion, is not sufficient. That's not the primary purpose of church, although that seems to have been enough to sort of keep people happy, unfortunately. Somebody says, defender of the faith. Which faith exactly? Yeah, so the Queen is, of course, the head of the Church of England. and one of the things she's sworn to do is to defend the faith, and her son has said he's going to defend the faiths, plural. I would argue that if there was a religion, a national religion at this point in the UK, in England, it would be more identified with our health service than with any relation to Christianity. It's the thing people would probably be prepared to go to war to defend. I think they'd be more likely to, well, but we mustn't fall for the sort of atheistic propaganda, because 60% of people in England do claim to believe in a God of some kind. And I think although there's declining church attendance, nonetheless, people don't on the streets, in my experience, claim to believe in no God at all. And right. There's of course, the Jordan Peterson style attempt to kind of reconcile a deep respect that still endures to some degree for Christianity with the sort of snobbish intellectual dismissal of tradition. And that's finding its way out in a sort of the Bible teaches us something, we're just not quite sure what. But that gives, that's different. I think it's worth saying that the religious situation is different, for example, from a place either that is filled with very strong religious beliefs that are different from Christianity. People here are more in a they're very rich. They're in a sort of hedonistic lifestyle full of distractions, and they somewhere in the back of their mind are aware of the gospel and want to ignore the contradiction between any sense that there's a higher morality that possibly they should be living up to versus their immediate desires.
I think that's a good point. Just one quick question here. This guy says ICKSP churches have been more resistant churches I have seen from my limited experience. What is that denomination, ICKSP? Are you aware? Can you maybe?
It's not one I'm familiar with. It's the Institute of Christ, the King, Sovereign Priest. But it's not one that I'm familiar with, I'm afraid.
Okay.
It looks like it's a subset of Roman Catholicism? Sorry, I don't know.
Okay.
There is, I would say, so I'm not Catholic myself, but my understanding is actually that the Catholics were relatively strong in England in saying that they wanted to continue to have their communion services, or well, they don't call it communions, but that's the reason that we've still had them in the Protestant world. I seem to think had it not been for the Catholic Church, we'd probably all have been having our wine and bread over Zoom. So I'm somewhat thankful. I think because Protestants don't view these things as salvific, we're less zealous about it, which is a bit of a shame. So yes, I'm somewhat grateful.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. So of course, that's a good point. So the trad Caths, or Catholicism in general, is it does place a salvific element upon the sacraments. So to be deprived of them would be a big problem. So I could understand why that particular church would be interested in keeping at least that aspect of their services open. Now, something you touched upon earlier that I thought was a good point was you're saying, yes, there's the materialistic wasteland. There's the cult of the state cult of the NHS.
Yes.
There's the people who are Christian are pretty much nominally Christian. You do have some sort of diehards like yourself, and maybe some older people or people who get radicalized through the internet who take the faith seriously.
Yeah.
But society in general has sort of drifted, and I think you are correct. You shouldn't fall for the atheist propaganda, because even though most people aren't, they may be culturally Christian to a certain extent, and I think they pretty much have to be, just because of the air they breathe. But people aren't atheists, even people who are not Christian. So the person I cite on this is probably one of 5 sociologists who isn't a crazy leftist. His name was Rodney Stark. He's an old timer, and he does and did a lot of studies on sociology of religion and society. And he once you break down sort of the statistics as far as what people profess to believe, there's much less atheists in the world than Richard Dawkins would like to have you believe. So, and this is true, and most of his studies were done in Europe. So, as an example, if you ask someone if they're Christian, you'll get a big chunk of answers that are no's. But if you ask them if they believe in some God or higher power, a lot more of them will say yes. So yes. They believe in something transcendent. They just don't have a name for it. And I think that's sort of man's innate spiritual impulse coming to the fore. So,
yeah. But it's true.
Go ahead.
No. Ask your question.
Oh, no problem, man. I was just going to say, would you say that's kind of been your impression of the current spiritual state in the UK and attitudes regarding supernatural?
Yes. It's probably the case where I live, which is a real hub of intellectualism and therefore, liberal secularism, that if you were in mixed sort of company, talking to people you'd never met before, you would be reluctant to admit to any spiritual beliefs. But people who are atheistic would feel entirely emboldened to speak. But I think similarly, by the sounds of it, to South Africa, I think the more rural you go, the further away from the universities you go in general, the more people are prepared to admit what I think they deep down understand about the world, which is that there is something other than the material. You will find people praying in difficult times. You'll find people, perfectly like normal everyday people will, if the subject comes up, say, oh yeah, I've always felt there is something. However, it's worth saying, in terms of the spiritual health of the country, the fact that it's become normalized to be quote unquote a good person and then think, oh, there's some vague deity, not necessarily good news, right? It's actually, I was saying, oh, nominalism is bad. Just saying you're a Christian and going along to church and thinking you're saved, that could be a problem. But at least those people have the chance of being told, Jesus says there's one way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Actually, the way people talk about it these days is more akin to find your own truth. Everyone can self-identify in all matters, including truth, it seems. If you, as long as you've lived up to your own. So when I went to university, for example, people would discuss each other's beliefs. What do you think, man? And there was never any implication that there was somebody was correct and somebody wasn't. The only place you found that was in the new atheist types, which were quite prevalent at that time. So at the time, I was really grateful to Christopher Hitchens and the like, because they were the only people who were drawing a line and saying, actually, religious belief, it isn't a matter of a broad canopy and invites everybody in. It matters. Their perspective was, well, this had caused 9/11. But my perspective was 9/11 is small fry. You want to think about eternity. But that kind of opens the conversation. So, give and take. The decline in the new atheist movement in the UK has also led to an increase in apathy, which can be quite dangerous. I can basically see the UK as, I think, apathetic on lots of levels is a good way to describe the country right now.
Yeah.
I think if
it seems like a very sedate place to live.
Yeah, I mean, think about the lifespan of a person. Towards the end of their life, they become senile and they're very suggestible, and they lean on others to be led around. That's what the country is like. If somebody suggestible came along and suggested that the population walked out to sea and drowned themselves, then most of the people here would sort of quietly do so. That would be that.
All right, then.
Come in and yeah, exactly.
All right. Yeah, no, that's something. The danger with deism, the danger with having some kind of vague faith, not tied to any tradition or creed or anything like that, just aside from being a good person or whatever, is it doesn't require anything of you as a believer. It doesn't have any dictates on how you should live your life. It doesn't tell you what you should really stand against, other than basically your own sort of conscience. And you can sort of come up with any number of excuses why you shouldn't stand against a thing or shouldn't be for a thing because it's mean or or something, I tweeted earlier in the day, the Lord doesn't want you to be happy. He wants you to do the right thing. Right. And, from a deistic frame point, it's really easy to just sort of shrug off and, yeah, man, whatever. Like you're saying in a university, you believe what you believe. I believe what I believe. And it's all cool, dude. I mean, that hippie bullshit is poison.
It works in a very limited context. So whilst you have plenty and nothing is threatening you, everyone can kind of be like, yeah, it's fine. Just, you believe this, I believe that. Who cares? It'll all be fine. The issue is when a moral question has practical significance, suddenly you need to know why. And that's the apathy that's so insidious. Right. People don't think. And we see that over the last year. The only moral value that we can assume everyone agrees with is essentially murder is wrong, and it comes down
the
to
NHS.
which ultimately the only reason people like the NHS is because they perceive the lack of a health service as an advocation of murder. So if anybody was to suggest the NHS gets slightly smaller, I mean, the argument that meant that we, one way of looking at the Brexit vote that happened was that there was this bus that went round and said that we'll have whatever it was, 350 million a week extra for the NHS. Why was that argument persuasive? Yes, on a surface level, because it was the NHS is our religion, but why the NHS? because 350 million pounds, presumably people can equate that to, oh, somebody I vaguely know could have had slightly more treatment and potentially not died. So everything's weighed up ultimately against death, because it's the only sort of moral standard we've been left with. I still think that ultimately the assumption that death is bad is a Christian assumption. So other cultures, had they decayed, may have been left with something different as the remains of their morality. But yeah, we believe that death is bad, as long as we can draw the lines of who counts as human carefully enough to allow us to still have copious amounts of sleeping around, and then resisting the consequences. Although I actually think that issue is probably one which pricks people's conscience on a deep level, and they're not prepared to admit it. I don't know of yes, people are very animated when they talk about abortion, but I do think that if anything was the issue that was going to awaken their conscience, surely if they thought about it, that would be it.
Yeah. No, in my experience, that is one of those topics which, even if people will say, they're pro-choice, they'll very often follow that up with, but I never do it myself. Right. So, yeah. That is one of those issues where I think there's at least some recognition that, maybe this is a bad thing. So even if they're not necessarily against it whole hog, they realize in their own soul there's a moral ambivalence about it, and it makes them very uncomfortable.
Yeah, people always talked about the UK having tolerance as its highest virtue. We must do everything to preserve our tolerance. We must tolerate everything and live with one another, whatever. But I think that the last year has surely disproven that notion. There was no attempt to be tolerant of one another disagreeing on the subject of COVID at all. That supposedly highest virtue was dropped in an instant. So yeah, other people might make a stronger argument in favor of tolerance being the highest virtue. Maybe tolerance was. I think what happened was tolerance was used temporarily in order to reduce the hold that Christianity had. We still have an established church, which is different from somewhere like America. So people might be under the impression, therefore, that the UK is a more religious, more Christianized place. But much like the monarchy has no practical power, so I think the Church of England really has no effect on the way that the country is run, and just contributes to the probably the general embarrassment of the elites having a terrible enshrinement of white, power in this supposedly multicultural country. I think that's the main ongoing effect of the establishment of the C of E, which is not enormously useful to us right now.
No, and C of E in general does seem, I'm not an expert, but from everything that I've seen, C of E does seem to be an especially, what did the cool kids say, paused institution at this point. So I guess shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah, they're slowly giving in on all sides, slightly latterly. Well, they hold out, a little bit longer than the rest of society. So I suppose you could argue that it has some effect on slowing down the way that things move. But then once the Church of England has jumped over the fence on an issue, then it really becomes beyond debate. So it has a sort of very temporary effect of conservatism, and then becomes a tool to. It's like what do you call it? Like sorry, the mechanism which kind of, as you turn it, it locks in.
Oh, a ratchet.
A ratchet, yes. So it has a ratcheting effect, where it is just lagging by 5 years, but making sure every 5 years that everything all the progress that has been made morally to work against the Bible is kind of locked in for good.
Right. So it goes forward and then it comes back, but never back as far as it did before. Right. So it sort of puts the brakes on some of the more extremes of society, but then it solidifies the ones that have already been made. So it functions sort of like Conservative Incorporated in the United States in that regard. It just it's the official face of quote unquote tradition that sort of ratifies, the less crazy parts of the status quo, only to ratify the crazy ideas 10 years down the line.
Yeah, and I'm not part of the Church of England myself. I'm aware there's lots of people in the Church of England who are working extremely hard to fight against this force. So I don't want to say that everyone in the C of E is NPC, but there's certainly not enough of them to hold back the sort of inevitable tide of wokeness. The Church, that's such a strong statement, isn't it?
Of course, a Puritan would say this, a neo-Puritan. Yeah. But, in a way, he's right. I don't think I would disagree with that entirely.
So the perspective that large organized churches get corrupted and need to be broken away from rather than reformed is obviously an idea that sits very well with Protestants. And we've got a fine tradition of repeatedly saying that the established church is useless and needs to be ignored. And I'm a Baptist, which I increasingly realize is sort of that idea taken to its extreme, where we just reject basically any kind of larger church structure whatsoever. And if we organize it at all, it's purely as a sort of insurance scheme, basically, just a way to cover one another's backs if we get into legal trouble, which I like, but I also acknowledge gives the Baptists far less of a voice on the world stage.
Yeah, no, and of course, and the problem also with that, coming in from the Orthodox perspective over here. It does.
Oh yeah. Well, from your perspective, I'm sure the Catholics have also broken away.
Yeah. Well, no, I was just saying the ability to sort of fracture away and stuff. If you assume the institution as a whole is corrupt and you want to sort of preserve the kernels of truth from a degenerate structure, I can understand that, and. The Orthodox position is kind of one where it looks at the Reformation era and it looks at the Catholics and it says, you guys have a point. And it also looks at the Protestants and says, you guys have a point, but you're both wrong.
Yeah. I mean, everybody names their denomination.
But I totally understand it. And the idea with the breaking away and sort of preserving, this happened in church history as well, including in the Eastern Orthodox Church, where you would have like some patriarch of so-and-so is sort of going off the deep end and whatnot. And, there's sort of steps to sort of correct that, or like most of the church for a long time, a lot of it fell under the Arian heresy. But enough of the church, a minority at the time, was able to sort of say, no, you guys are wrong. You guys are preaching heresy. And then, in time they're able to correct that. But for a while there, they were kind of a sort of voice in the wilderness trying to preserve, the truth and sort of carry it into the future. And I totally understand that impulse. But of course, the danger with that obviously is, you also, that allows for some sort of more wacky ideas to sort of get out there. Yeah. But, I think you could also argue that you're going to be saddled with wacky ideas anyways. So it's
true.
it is what it is.
Obviously, Baptists are not the only group who's broken away. I guess I'm part of a bigger tradition of nonconformity that would include like the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Unitarians, and each time this happens, the small group that breaks off ends up losing their voice. So largely, if you're not aware of the complexities of Christianity, I think most people assume the Pope just speaks for all Christians across the world. Yeah. When you realize then there's such a thing as the Reformation, in Europe at least, you then assume the Church of England is all that exists. So when you become a splinter of a splinter of a splinter, you become invisible to most people. It's the kind of I see a lot of parallels with libertarianism. You become ideologically pure, yeah. And then you kind of achieve nothing on a larger scale,
right?
But I'm sort of, in a way, it is personally quite comforting to just stick doggedly to your ideological purity and accept that, whilst you may not be achieving anything, at least you can look down on the other people who claim to be on your side for compromising.
You could be in your lonely tower, just like staring down your nose at all the plebs down there.
The other way of looking at it as well, if you never try, of course you never fail. But better to fail trying. And that's to some degree the issue, that it's difficult to spot people in England even really trying at this point to be different and distinct. There's a lot of oh no, don't listen to the terrible things you've heard about us, we're really harmless. I don't know if the church wants to look harmless.
No.
Don't we want to be the Lion of Judah, roaring?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, and no matter what denomination you are, I think that's something all Christians everywhere should sort of get behind, this idea of a facile, no, we're nice, please don't say bad things about us.
Right.
That sort of mindset will get you nowhere. It will serve two purposes. It will get you resented by your enemies, and the people who are looking for an institution which is not of this world will see it and be like, see, they buckle just like everybody else.
And whilst I've criticized the traditional organized forms of Christianity in the UK, but it has to be said that Protestantism is riddled with attempts to reach out culturally to the country, and most people's perception. I was taught this in school, in religious education, that you have essentially Catholics and high Anglicans on one side, and they stick to what the Bible says, and then you have liberal Christianity, who are essentially totally in favor of every progressive moral teaching, but choose to continue going along to church. And that, on one side you've got hymns written in the 19th century, and on the other side you've got adapted versions of pop songs. So
you got, my buddies and I, we call it G chord Christianity.
Yeah, right, but the 4-chord song type. Yes, you can if you don't know the words of a modern hymn, you can usually just sing "Don't Stop Believing" and it'll fit perfectly well over the chord progression. So I like to think that I'm part of a nice, small, fervent subset of people who are perfectly willing to say, I accept the Bible moral teachings over modern moral teachings, but I don't accept church tradition. But that group, I talked about a third of the country being church attending. The number of people in England who I'd classify in that group is vanishingly small. I mean, at this point, people are like no joke, there's missionaries being sent from all the countries that were originally Christianized back to England on a rescue mission, which is
So
quite
sad.
weird to think about, but it's kind of needed. But you do come across a lot of cases of shake the dust off your feet as you leave, because people just don't want to hear. They think they understand the gospel as being little baby Jesus in a manger who then grows up and hates the gays. That's kind of most people's perception of Christianity, and they don't want to hear.
Creator, master of the universe, salvation, grace, and all that,
None
all
of
that
that
good
is
stuff.
featured. Yeah,
Justice in the afterlife. No.
So now, if you think about the world as being, to some degree, under the dominion, I mean, ultimately under God's dominion, but he's given the dark forces reign. The tactic that's being used in England is, let's promote apathy. And if they aren't going to fall for apathy, let's use their religious instinct against them. So the likes of Richard Dawkins, for example, is one of the most moralizing people, who will spend most of his time explaining how angry you should be at Christianity, and then as a side point,
because of how mean it is,
right? But then just, by the way, morality doesn't exist. There's nothing but pitiless indifference in the universe when you think about it. But anyway, let me get back to telling you. Let me get back to telling you how evil Christianity is, and how much superior the morals that I'd like to give you are. So yes, if you were brought up with Christian parents, you're much more statistically, you're much more likely to be involved in an atheist movement. So all the people who are going on r/atheism and so on, those people were brought up going to Sunday school, but they're a minority at this point. So if you're spending all of your time thinking of ways to pwn the atheists, you are going after a fringe group, actually.
That was 2008.
Yeah, I mean, that was fun. It was fun while it lasted, wasn't it? I think it's still useful. Those people who are Christians, so people who are growing up now, parents are taking them to church, and then they go into school, and they will encounter state-mandated anti-Christian propaganda. And to some degree, that was me as well when I was growing up. For me, getting into apologetics was extremely important, because I knew my faith on a deep, intuitive level, but I found it clashing with my mind after I was confronted with some of these arguments. I talked about there being a sleepwalking away from our positive Christian inheritance as a nation. Some of that is guided sleepwalking. It's sort of grandma's being stolen from the old people's home by malicious forces. There's a kind of let's be on the lookout, because although most people aren't thinking about it, I think those who end up in positions of power are quite thoughtful. There's increasing bits of the government that are useful in the UK for pushing anti-Christian perspectives, and those positions are being taken up by people who have an agenda.
Well, I would totally agree with that. And not just in the UK, but everywhere. And I guess that sort of leads to sort of my next question, which is sort of, how do you think sort of things got so messed up? How did the spiritual state of the UK fall to such depths compared to where it once was?
Yeah. So in a way, there's a long history of quite miserable sounding Christians for several hundred years talking about how bad the UK is or how bad England is. So I sort of joined that. I actually think most of those people were right, and it has got worse, just slowly. And then there's been some interesting cases of revival happening where some event, but usually ultimately just attributed to being miraculous, has caused an enormous increase in Christianity being taken up. But the overall trend has been a decline, and I think it's happening over such a long time scale. The only sensible overall statement to say on that subject is God never said that England would be his nation. Like people always want to think, oh, we're like Israel or whatever. God chose to bless this country enormously with a Christian heritage, and that seems to coincide, probably not coincidentally, with enormous material improvements. And then he used the British Empire to spread Christianity graciously around the world. But the British Empire has lost both its position on the world stage and its spiritual position as a beacon of to look to. There's still certainly a legacy, and it's ahead of a lot of countries in the world. But nations rise, nations fall. The word of the Lord stands forever. I'm more interested in seeing the church continue. So if you look at places like China, which looks extremely hostile to the church, actually the number of Christians there is growing year on year. And why is that happening? Ultimately, I believe that's God's will. So it's not to say that God couldn't sort of change the direction and bring back the church in this country. But I think our best hope for seeing Christianity return in a big way in the country is prayer. Not to say that we can't also be the instrument for that to happen, but it seems pretty clear that the tide is moving in a certain direction, to me. Oh, well, you can look at it statistically, but there's only so much that the statistics can tell you. I mean, the fact that people are not attending church anymore could be merely an expression of the existing lack of belief that they had anyway, and they're just losing that as a cultural practice. I'm always conscious of not wanting to make assumptions. It could well be that the number of actual Christians throughout history in England has been quite small, and that the majority of people were going along with general attitudes,
sort of cultural inertia, basically.
Yes, exactly. So one way or another, it's in some ways most atheists are probably quite surprised that the church is sticking around as well as it is, whereas most Christians are dismayed at the fact that it's disappearing at all. So it's a matter of perspective to some degree. I think that it's going to be the case fairly soon, as in, like, we're talking decades away before Christianity being practiced honestly is a criminal offense in the country. And I think that reality will probably inspire the Christians who are genuine to live out their faith much more strongly, and that actually might be a good thing for the church. I remember talking to people who grew up in the Soviet Union, who then moved to the UK, and they said that being a Christian in the UK was actually much harder. I don't know if that's the sort of encouragement.
How did they mean that?
Because it's too easy in a country that's this comfortable and doesn't provide you any resistance to your faith. You don't have to think about it. It's actually the worst thing that God could do is give everybody an easy life with no hardships for their entire existence, because you just skate on through. You're never forced to think about anything. So I don't know if that's the sort of encouragement that our listeners were hoping for. Good news, guys. Persecution is coming.
Pray for persecution so we can be based once more. Yes.
Yeah. But personally, I found myself really yearning for that direct persecution to come. And like in some ways, I'd like nothing more in my life than to end up going to prison for the gospel. So one of the most frustrating things over the last year has been not quite being given enough
reason to
oppose, because all of the people I've talked, no, not all of them, but a large number of the wise Christians around me have made one argument and another why it's our duty to obey what we've been told to do. But there's got to come a breaking point. I think when that breaking point happens, we will be disappointed initially by how few people who we were hoping would stand up do. But there will be some. There are Christians who I know and I'm talking to who have extremely strong convictions and are sort of champing at the bit to do something to kind of reinvigorate any kind of passion in the church. We've had to put up with a drippy, half-hearted form of Christianity for too long, and I'm ready. I'm ready for that day to come when I get to stand up and be counted, and I know other people are as well.
No, that's in it. I think that's a great point, and I'm going to skip question 3. This leads good into 4, and then we'll come back to 3.
Okay.
So this is tied in. What you're talking about right now is tied in with the future of Christianity in England, and sort of not only there, but I feel the Western world more broadly. So what is the future? And I think you're sort of right. I think what we're seeing right now in America, probably in the UK, is a falling away among the more sort of go along to get along, friendly, unscary versions of Christianity.
Yeah.
The ones that try to look more like the world. People, I think, see the lack of, like I said, it breeds contempt for the people who are the enemies of the church. And they're just like, see, they're weak, they're disgusting, they're doing what we say. And the people who are the person on the street who's spiritual but not religious, or who's just sort of like, an agnostic and like tormented in their soul, and they want to believe in something, but they don't know what to believe. They see happy-go-lucky, just sort of nice Christianity, and they say, this is fake. Yeah. This isn't. These people don't really believe it. They don't radically believe it, and so that turns them off because it comes off as insincere. And I'm not saying all churches are like that, but I'm saying enough of them are that turns people off. And like you were saying earlier, the constant barrage of propaganda through education, through media, through social media, all these things is very deleterious to fostering a spiritual mindset early on and sort of carrying that on into adulthood. So my personal take on the future of Christianity sort of lines up with yours in a certain sense, which is that things are going to become more difficult to honestly live out your faith. And that could come in a number of ways. So for an example, there could be some law which says, discrimination of all kinds is illegal. So now Catholics or Orthodox or, some sort of Baptist sect somewhere or Missouri Synod Lutherans, now you guys have to ordain women and bless homosexual marriage. Otherwise, you're in trouble. If that sort of, and I think that sort of thing may come. If it does, like you, I almost would be relieved because it would be like, no, we're not doing this. And you can call us bad guys, whatever, but the response would have to be firm. And I think sort of at that point, you'll have some churches that will say, we're all about inclusivity and God is love and blah, blah, blah. You'll have those sorts. But I also think you'll have quite a lot of churches who are like, all right, this is it, boys.
Yeah.
Now's the time to sort of,
it might be worth in thinking about what's going to happen with the church. Splitting down the types of churches a little bit, because I was thinking about it. I don't know if this is comprehensive, but maybe if there's 5 broad categories of churches that I am aware of in the UK. So maybe the first is the Church of England, and they, I think, will increasingly drift in the same direction that the country is going. That is, their official teaching will move away from biblical teaching. I don't actually see any signs that the church will disestablish. And there may be a few congregations around, because the Church of England churches, there's an enormous variety. Low church C of E, there's people around who think that they're having a positive impact just by being there. It's kind of the equivalent of saying, well, I'm going to vote. I know that nobody here represents me, but at least I'm going to show up. So, but I think you'll see my prognosis for the C of E is not good long term. Then maybe if we think about the other trad groups around in the UK, Catholics and Orthodox and of various stripes, those groups have the advantage of being culturally different. The people who attend those churches, in my experience, are, and again, there's I think that we'll see this split in all of them. So there are people who, for example, their family considers themselves to be Catholic. They're only going to have their family show up to their wedding if they get married in a Catholic church, that sort of thing. So they don't really believe it. But of the people attending those churches, they seem to be less interested in going along with the rest of culture anyway. So maybe there's more hope there, as long as the broader organizations that they belong to don't themselves drift. Sometimes the Pope says some worrying things. So we'll see. Then I guess the group that I belong to, sort of non-conforming, evangelical, reformed type people. And now I'd like to think there's a significant amount of people who basically their entire identity is like sticking doggedly to what the Bible says, regardless of what anybody tells them. And I think that subset is the group most likely to make individual sacrifices and end up, in the long tradition of being religiously persecuted for being a Christian in the UK. So it's not a new thing in some ways, but certainly there's other non-conforming groups who don't conform because they want to be particularly woke. So I'm sure that we will see that continue. And I guess related to that is the charismatic groups. I've been to quite a few churches in the UK which are really quite strong on their things like speaking in tongues and healings, things like that. Those churches they tend to be the most pioneering in various regards. So they're the ones who have the most sophisticated sound systems and lighting systems in their churches. They're the churches that make the most headway on being charitable organizations, and they'll be extremely well organized and get a lot done out in the community. In my experience, they tend to put the preaching slightly on the back burner. And when push comes to shove, I've often seen them pulling punches on significant issues. So their view tends to be, so interestingly, there's this split somewhat within the evangelicals between those who want to be evangelistic, and the only thing they talk about is the gospel and never address anything else. And then people say, well, how are you different? The same sort of thing happens amongst the more charismatic groups that, we don't want to offend people. We want to come across as nice.
If I can interject here, that was sort of my experience growing up for a long time. Like I attended a sort of non-denominational evangelical church that was, how would you say? It had, because we've gotten to a sort of a point now in Christian history where evangelicals and Pentecostals used to be a different thing, but now, in my experience, they've kind of merged, like the overlap. Like that Venn diagram is pretty big. So I attended sort of a non-denominational evangelical church, but it had Pentecostal charismatic elements to it. And that was definitely sort of my experience. So it would be very gospel oriented, very much, Jesus and all that sort of stuff, but not a whole lot of, the more, not the sort of Calvinist Old Testament fire and brimstone sort of sermon, sinners in the hand of an angry God sort of the sort of messages that you would find. Much more friendly.
I think you find on one end of the spectrum is basically super penty, Hillsong, and then further, you get a lot of prophetic words, a lot of imagery coming up. In the middle is the kind of what's the phrase they use? Open but cautious towards spiritual gifts. So they're not front and center, but if somebody wants to give a word or something, then they're open to it, and then the extreme other end is cessationist, sort of, we're going to be very old school, we're going to lean almost towards the brethren approach, like super strict morality is extremely important to us, and we want to sort of freeze life in about 1880, because that was when the world reached its peak.
In some ways, it was.
So they can make a very strong argument for that. Yes, it's a spectrum there, maybe. And I think on all places across the spectrum, you get those that are interested in Christianity because it makes them feel good, that they feel like they're doing the right thing. And then you have those that are actually in a relationship with God. And I think we will see that distinction drawn out in practice much more and more. And then the last group I was just going to briefly mention was there's a lot and an increasing number of churches in the UK who are defined by ethnicity. So you get big, like sort of black gospel churches. You've got a lot of church buildings which are used at different times during the week for things like a Korean church. Those subgroups are almost always largely out of, in my experience, they're sort of out of contact with the sort of native Christianity. And so it's almost like a grab bag. It's difficult to talk about them all. There's some very good things to be said about each of those subgroups, but do they represent the future of spirituality in the UK? It's difficult to see any of them really being big enough to make a sizable difference. I think they tend to be more expressions of we're a small community who've found ourselves here away from our own
homeland,
mother country. And so we're going to continue to meet together in a way that we're comfortable with. And I kind of feel like fair enough. It's a shame in some ways because I like the fact
they tend to be more traditional in some regards, I've noticed.
Yes, because they're not pretending to be part of the British culture. Churches which are British are a bit stuck because they've been trying to change pace. I remember when I went to my the carol service at university and brought a bunch of my non-Christian housemates with me. This is a kind of classic UK university thing that the Christian Union puts on a big carol service. The students go along because they think of it as a quaint bit of tradition, and then they get hit with a sort of half an hour extremely quote unquote relevant sermon, making lots of popular culture references and trying to make Jesus seem applicable. But basically I'm being cynical and sarcastic, but it's, largely a thing that I approve of. But it was interesting seeing their reaction to the fact that the Christian Union, of course, had decked out this traditional old church in the latest of modern lighting and projection systems, and were doing all the most up-to-date modern sounding songs. And the reaction from my housemates was, this is horrific. Why would you wreck what is a British institution? I think that shows you, because I was quite surprised by this reaction, which I think what I tell that anecdote to illustrate is that I, as a person who grew up in a British church, was unaware quite how driven we were to be up to date and culturally appropriate, and therefore, being traditional, although we have traditional buildings and the odd kind of weird hangover, we mostly think of ourselves as being ourselves. So we just bring everything about modern culture leaks in to the beliefs and the approach of the church. And if you hear a modern woke word invented, you just have to wait 3 or 4 years and it'll be being used in a respectful way from the pulpit, without a second thought, just as if it was always a word in the English language. Because it's absorbed into popular culture, and then it's kind of accepted without question and just made to align with the meaning might be slightly tweaked, but a lot of the church in the UK doesn't see itself as traditional at all. That's not a drive. There's an implicit assumption of liberalism and democratic
Right.
values, for example, that's just absolutely unquestioned.
Yeah, no, I think that's a point, a good point. The paradigm through which most people in the West interpret Christianity is through a liberal lens.
Yeah.
And
it's almost like Jesus came to earth to give us the vote. It's how people see it.
Yeah. He came down from heaven to give you. He came down with a ballot and a constitution. Yeah, that's
the greatest suffragist fighter.
Yeah. No, that's terrible. But yeah, a little more on the sort of going forward into the future. Long term, what do I see? I think we are going to see a spiritual rebirth of sorts for the reasons that we've laid out. So the secular humanism envisioned by like the new atheist era, I think it's totally failed. And I think people see that it's failed. Now people aren't atheists anymore. They're just sort of adrift, right? And this is something that I think the Jordan Peterson phenomenon kind of highlighted, that, even if people don't believe or can't bring themselves to believe in Christianity, they kind of want to, they see, they see the value in it at the very least. And I think as the pressure increases, and as there's a falling away of the marginal Christians, and the more liberal churches are going to sort of see further losses made, I think it's going to be a shining example, shining opportunity for the churches and the Christians who do take the faith seriously to stand tall. And I think that is going to their example of courage and moral example in a time of degeneracy and collapse is, I think, going to attract a lot of people. And I think you are sort of seeing this already. So I think more based sects of Protestantism, sort of like mostly carried forward by sort of smaller independent churches. Like I know some Baptist churches are on cultural grounds and on moral grounds are very often quite sound, and they're pretty staunch and sort of not compromising on that sort of thing. Certain aspects of traditionalist Catholicism are also going to, I think, sort of have that opportunity as well. And increasingly in the West, although it's a relatively new element on the scene, is Orthodox Christianity. I think Orthodox Christianity is going to be playing a much bigger role in sort of the Christian discourse going in the future, particularly in America, because the problem that Orthodoxy has had throughout history is it was either under the heel of unfriendly Muslims or under the heel of communists for the longest time.
You guys mean that none of the rest of us can complain about oppression ever.
Well, I myself am a convert, so I'm late to the scene, but and sort of there was just never a large population of Eastern Orthodox in the West. Now, with the passage of time, you're seeing more communities pop up. And for the past, century or so, they've sort of existed in these kind of ethnic ghettos, unfortunately, these churches. But I think that's starting to change. And it's certainly changed in the United States. It is not a folk religion anymore in America. It still is, I would probably say, maybe in the UK, but the idea that you're Orthodox because you're Greek or because you're Russian is no longer the case. So like in the state I grew up in Alaska, the church I attended was probably, I think, all converts, or if they weren't converts, their parents were converts, sort of thing. So the Antiochian Church in America, for example, which was the jurisdiction that I attended, 80% of all their priests are converts from other denominations or faiths. So, and the reason for that, I think, is because, in a world of, changing, shifting sands, looking at something that sort of stands sort of the test of time and is very clear in its dogmas and what it's not willing to negotiate on, I think that does have appeal to people. And, I think, like I said, I think people will find aspects of that in other denominations, but, I think, and I hope that, to a certain extent, Orthodoxy is going to become the religion of the future, at least to a larger degree than it is now. But we'll see about that.
Yeah, I'm always reluctant to predict the future because I think I fundamentally don't believe it's something that we can know any details about. We can certainly sort of try to pick up two things: overall theological eschatological ideas and broad trends. And a trend can give you, I think, a pretty high percentage chance of being right about the future. But if you ever make certain predictions about the future and then you're wrong, you were probably making a perfectly reasonable guess, but there's always that small chance. And especially when you factor in that we do believe in a God who can come in and make things happen that were totally out of nothing, right?
Yeah. Literal miracles.
If we assume that all the behavior on the planet is driven out of individuals' actions and choices, you might get extremely predictable macro effects. But I think you could always be wrong-footed by God causing something to happen. But that caveat aside, I'm very interested in your idea that we're in for a sort of spiritual revival of some sort. I'm conscious of that having been predicted many times in the past.
No. What I'm saying is I'm not saying like,
I think what you were saying was not larger numbers, but those that are around being enlivened in their faith, which I do agree with. I think that's right.
Yes. And when that does happen, when basically the only Christianity left and the only Christians left are, true Christians.
But it has happened in countries before.
That is going to have an evangelistic effect of its own, for no other reason than the fact that these are people sort of apart from everything else going on.
It has happened before that basically all the Christians in a country have been either killed or have left. So that could happen in the whole West. I'm not going to rule that possibility out, that the persecution becomes so severe and direct.
I don't think it's persecution.
Yeah, like is it impossible that the public could reach the conclusion that it is Christianity that was responsible for all of the ills of history? That's not impossible. I don't think anything is impossible for people to be believed in. And maybe more significantly, is there any driver, is there any reason that powers that be would want Christianity wiped out? Well, okay, clearly yes. If we're talking demonic powers directly, yes, that's obvious. But what's the downside of Christianity for a consumeristic, materialistic culture?
Right.
Christianity forces people Jesus says to the rich man, to sell everything he owns because how hard it is to get into the kingdom of heaven if you're rich, whereas everything that is asked of you as a citizen these days is to spend, essentially, and everything that's asked of you morally as well, in your life, apart from money, is to consume, to be hedonistic, to you've basically got two jobs from when you're born. One is to identify your wants, and the second one is to achieve your wants. It's almost the morality that you end up with if you take the Disney movie idea of love. It's like you see the character who is just struck one day with a desire, right, that they didn't previously have, usually for another person, and then the good of the rest of the story, all of the good characters drive this want to be fulfilled, and then all of the evil characters in the story are somehow standing in the way of that. So then what happens when you generalize that teaching? Oh, well, it applies to food, it applies to sexuality, it applies to drugs, it applies to living forever on this world. So yes, I think it's very plausible that, we've seen plenty of occasions where people have said religion generally is the problem, like the Marxists or you know a lot more about this than me, but my understanding is that the fascist conception of Christianity was as potentially a tool that could be subverted and used. So we can take the existing religion and twist it to make people into religious drones for our use, which is slightly different from stamping it out. But I don't know. Is that accurate? Well,
it's a bit of both, actually.
Okay.
So on the one hand, in Italy, they started off as pretty anti-clericalist, but then they sort of lightened up on it once they sort of actually had a chance of seizing power, because they didn't want to alienate, the overwhelmingly Catholic population of Italy at the time.
Yes.
And they, the reason the Vatican exists is because of Mussolini, with the Lateran Pact of 1929. So there was some concessions made to the church. They also gave the church a large role in sort of education of the Italian public. But then there was a backlash against that, and they became more fascist over time. And the reason is they saw, rightly, that traditionalist Christian morality and teaching was at odds to some extent with the fascist projects, and with the more so with the fascist ideology, that the primacy of the state is the supreme authority, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Well, what if the state is against God,
Yeah,
then,
right.
And it's not so clear. Then so there was elements or efforts to sort of, I think, use Christianity to a certain extent to sort of ingratiate themselves to the public and to sort of gain public support on their way to power. But then there was also the recognition that Christianity, in a very real way, was actually a competing worldview, which didn't exactly coincide with the fascists. And in Germany, it was even more explicit. So there was even more hostility to Christianity than in Italy, and I think a lot more sort of outright animosity towards it by the Third Reich. But that it is what it is. Now, I was just going to say, sort of my question 3. I guess I was going to bring this up. What do you think is, so we've sort of talked about sort of big picture. Now let's bring it down to just sort of a small level. In your experience, what is the most difficult part about being a Christian in England today? And this could be like both for you and or generally speaking.
Well, it's difficult to know. Yeah, there's a lot of directions to potentially go with that invitation to talk on many different potential subjects. So I would say I want to be contextually sensitive of history. Being a Christian in the UK, day to day, is extremely easy compared to many other times throughout history, because we are not being directly persecuted. I think that's more or less fair to say. Now, our beliefs are not entirely tolerated, and there's a limited patience. If you wanted to talk to somebody about the gospel, which as a Christian I think you ought to want to do, so I've had these conversations with many people. There's a sort of elephant in the room, which is sexuality. And if you end up having that conversation where you say, as a Christian, I don't think it would be right if I was to, for a start, sleep with somebody outside marriage.
Yeah.
Right? And for a second, ever marry somebody of the same sex. And now there's the new one of, or identify as somebody of a different sex. At that point, the patience runs pretty thin. So there's a sort of general perception that people in Britain think of themselves as tolerant and open-minded, but actually there's an extreme closed-mindedness. People are not wanting to be challenged on their beliefs. So I think the biggest challenge of being a Christian in the UK is the temptation to be worldly, because it's extremely comfortable. We're not persecuted. When we try and push the boundaries, we don't seem to get anywhere. Having said that, I have had conversations with people who've been really interested, and there are people turning to Christ in the country. If there was none of that happening, I'd actually say it may be immoral for Christians to remain in the UK at all, and we should just leave and go somewhere else where people are more willing to listen.
Just like the old Puritans, right? Went to America. Yeah.
I've got a lot of. I once did a quiz on the internet to find, one of these like BuzzFeed style quizzes of which denomination are you, and I ended up with Puritan. So maybe that tells you something.
It was BuzzFeed, man. So maybe it's all cock. Who knows?
It wasn't actually BuzzFeed. I don't think they could name 3 different denominations. Yeah. So yeah, the like materialist culture is so pervasive that it's difficult to even acknowledge. Like the basic assumption is that people will spend all of their money that they have on luxury goods. I mean, the way people think about it is that this is essentials. It's like, oh, because I'm not buying the best quality food in the supermarket. I'm only buying like what would be the equivalent of a king's diet 100 years ago. Therefore, I'm living in a restricted way. Oh, because I'm only because I choose to wear a jumper rather than heating my palatial house at winter, I'm therefore living within my means. So there's kind of no, there's an extreme level of expectation of personal quality of life. So people are never aware of their own. It's striking how little context anybody has for like their lives and what they're actually living in.
These are just basically too comfortable.
Yeah, like you would, if you were,
okay,
yeah, and because like when I immediately reflect on my life, I don't think of myself as being rich, unless I'm a bit more introspective. Like if you came to me and said, "What's difficult about being a Christian?" You know, living in the king's palace a few hundred years ago, I'd be like, well, it is quite opulent. That brings challenges. Whereas I think most people in this country are dissatisfied with their lives, despite having such enormous material wealth.
Yeah.
So it's
the emptiness of materialism, you know?
Yeah, most people's view is I'd be happy if only, and then they would list a few material things. You're like, oh, if only I had a little bit more time off work, if only I had a little bit more money so I could buy a better car, if only I had a little bit more money so I could, or whatever. And in terms of relationships, most people don't seek a long-term relationship when they're young at all. If they end up in one, it's still viewed, even whilst they're in the peak of the relationship, it's still viewed as being a temporary thing. Everything's about living in the moment and kind of distracting yourself until you die.
It's things like this that make me glad I was homeschooled and turned out weird.
Yeah, I wasn't homeschooled. But after watching Radlib's streams about it, I got quite jealous. I will confess.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And you know, I think this is the problem with being a Christian in the UK. I think is the problem with being a Christian in the West, more broadly speaking. It's that the lens through which we view everything is nice. You have to be nice.
Yes.
And at all costs, you must be nice. You must be polite. You must be accepting. You must be, quote, inclusive. And
it's such a milquetoast standard to try to live to, isn't it?
And if you don't, you're a bigot. And we're going to try and, shut you down. And we're going to find out where you live. And we're going to, trying to get you fired from your job and whatnot. Yeah. So that sort of thing. So on the one hand, the problem is the sort of liberal mindset of just everything has to be nice and the sort of force behind that, right? Which in certain cases, I'm not going to criticize any one particular person, but from my perspective, there's been times of where I want to say have the base take or whatever in like a polite company, but if I do, then I know there's going to be some pushback and it's just going to cause drama, and whose mind am I going to change anyway, so I might as well just say nothing, so that sort of thing. So I think it's the sort of liberal mindset of society at large, coupled with fear, lack of courage, cowardice. I've had instances of cowardice in my own life, my own walk of faith, and I'm not ashamed of it, but it's just a reality. There's things I don't say in public because they would ruin friendships or or whatever. That's a very real thing. And
friendships career progression as well.
Yep.
I've definitely been very guarded in what I say. Sometimes it's sensible. It's picking your battles, right?
Keeping your powder dry. Yeah.
You've got to decide. So to some degree, I think, were I not a Christian, it's much more likely I would have taken strong action to oppose the lockdowns. And there's been a fair bit of commentary in the lockdown critical circles of religious people for this reason, that they found, Christians don't want to take action. Why is this? It's not acceptable. I think it's a correct observation, and in some ways, it's not something that I regret. It's quite a conscious decision that you sometimes do only have one hill to die on in your life. As soon as you become persona non grata, or worse, a criminal, and then imprisoned, and you're out of society or executed or whatever, like there comes a point at which you can no longer fight for anything. And actually, I think that
you want it to count, basically.
Our country, like England, and also the West in general, it's a very reasonable thought that Christianity is going to get pushed to extinction, and there will come an opportunity to stand for that. So I don't want. It would be a shame to never stand for anything. But that's how you have to play your cards in life, isn't it? You don't know what's going to happen in the future. So if I thought it was preposterous that Christianity was at risk, or if I wasn't a Christian, I might choose the lockdowns to be my line in the sand. But I don't think that is the case, right? I think that there's likely to be another opportunity to nail my colors to the mast. But I will say, I ought to put a line in the sand and say, look, if churches are not meeting again in person at some point, it's no longer a matter of civil liberties, it's religious liberties that I'm worried for here. Both being important, but I think religious liberties being more important. Like, I wouldn't, I guess, had I thought of this a year ago, perhaps I would have said 12 months with the line in the sand. But then had I thought about it a year ago, I probably would have said 6 months with the line in the sand. So maybe they've tricked me into never drawing my line. But currently, the signs are that everything's going to open up over the summer. Now, I'd be extremely surprised if they don't suddenly discover a new variant has appeared and we lock back down again over Christmas. But maybe my line in the sand ends up being 2 years at this point. I don't know. Maybe I should say less than that. Is that too long? No. Sorry, we're slightly off topic here, but I think it's in the ballpark of, like, Christianity is under direct attack here. In the UK, we've not been allowed to meet in person as a church anywhere in the country. It's been literally illegal for over a year. So I remember somebody tweeting out, spare a thought for countries around the world where Christians are not allowed to meet, and they listed off, like, China, North Korea, and then put the UK at the end of the list. And there's that's something to think about. Maybe we should see this as significant. Well, I think we should very likely see this as much more sinister than we've been led to view it as. Yeah.
No, I would certainly agree. And I just sort of my last point on this question is, it's just in my own personal life, and I think this is true of people in Western countries, generally speaking, is the material comforts, the material temptations and things like that. Like, I wake up in the morning and my routine, and part of it's being a dad, of a young boy, you know, I'm busy, and my a lot of my free time's gobbled up with that. But even before I had a kid, you know, what did I want to do when I woke up? I wanted to I wanted to get my coffee. I wanted to get my YouTube on my phone, listen to some based podcasts, go up on the roof, look at the mountains. I wanted to do that before taking a shower, and then, you know, and then working. And then after I worked, I'm tired. I want to relax. I want to wind down. So I'll go to the gym after having a snack. And then, you know, and then night comes along, and, hey babe, you know, you want to watch a movie? Okay, yeah, let's do that. And then it's just these sort of mundane creature comforts that take away. Like, and it's still to this day, like that is, and I've gotten better at it. I'm sort of avoiding that theme by trying to have sort of a disciplined spiritual manner. But gosh, you know, these creature comforts, they bite you in the ass every time. I mean, it's a real problem. And just farting around on the internet or whatever it is, you know, it's when I should be starting. And I've been trying to start every morning with prayer, but, you know, sometimes I wake up and, you know, I'd rather go outside and listen to a podcast and drink my coffee and just drag my feet. So in a way, like, you know, and I'm not rich either, but I am well off enough so that I am, you know, I don't have to worry about all these other things. You know, I can just sort of dink around and play my bass instead of reading the Bible. And one of the things that living in South Africa in some ways, though, has made me a little bit less that way in terms of the constant like need to like my problem is I want to enjoy the stuff that I have, but I don't really want to go out and get more stuff, if that makes sense. So like materially speaking, you know, living in a country like this, you're really struck, you know, by sort of how much stuff you have relative to so many other people that live, you know, just a mile that way. And so for me at least, like getting much the problem is as much as sloth in a certain sense, spiritual sloth and laziness. So like the cost of living is low enough here. I don't have to work particularly hard or earn particularly a lot of money to live quite a comfortable life by any standard. And so, you know, I just go on the easy street, and you know, it's weird. Like I'll go to some of these smaller towns out here, and I'll just be driving around, and then I'll go through a farm, and I'll see the people who live on the farm, farm laborers, and they have they're living like a life that is almost semi-feudal. Like the house is owned by the farm owner. You know, they work for him. All their needs are met.
Interesting. Yeah.
You know, they got enough money for food. They got enough money to like drink a little bit on the weekend. But you know, I look at them and I'm seeing them and they seem, you know, actually like quite happy and stuff. Yeah. Particularly compared to a lot of the people who make a bit more money, sort of work. You know, they have sort of it seems they have kind of in a way, now I'm not saying I want to change places with them, but in a way, their problems, while they have them, are different than the sort of problems I have. Mine is just like, I just want to be Mr. Easy Street, and, you know, I can't be bothered with spiritual matters. But so I think that's kind of the problem. You know, the devil's tempting me with, you know, if you read the Screw Tape letters, it's like everybody's got their little thing that, you know, that Satan tries to get you with. And for someone, it can be, oh, you need to climb that corporate ladder. Oh, why are you don't have time to pray. You need to be making your business grow. Or for someone else, it might be sex. For someone else, it might just be being lazy. So there's any number of things out there, but I think the Western ones are definitely material creature comforts. That's the devil on our shoulder. It's the devil that says, be nice, don't say anything. And it's the other devil that says, enjoy these things. Don't worry too much about the Bible.
Yeah. So. Amos 6 is always striking in this regard. It says, woe to you who are complacent in Zion, and to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria. And then a bit later it says, you put off the day of disaster and bring near a reign of terror. You lie on beds adorned with ivory and lie on your couches. You dine on choice lambs and fatted calves. You strum away on your harps like David and improvise on musical instruments. You drink wine by the bowlful and use the finest lotions, but you do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore, you'll be among the first to go into exile. Now, obviously, it's a prophecy about a specific group. But nonetheless, this attitude of like, what are you spending your time doing? You're lounging about, eating good food and music. And I totally resonate with that, and with what you were saying as well, of like, you wake up and you have at your fingertips essentially like musicians. It's like you click your fingers and you tell your court musician to come in and play your favorite song to you. Yeah. And then but neither of us are rich if you compare us to like other people who are alive currently. But nonetheless, as you say, we have access to food relatively easily, right? Compared to people who you're seeing. I guess that's one of the differences of living in England, is that it's fairly easy to be oblivious to that. You can live a pretty isolated life, and everywhere in England is from the outside looks stately, and it looks somewhat respectable. Like that's not true of some of the sort of industrialized bits of the country, but at least for the majority, a lot of people in the UK will only see other comfortable people, and that seems like the entire world. That's just kind of expected. Now, you can use that unique privileged position in a positive way. So, for example, not only do we have access to all of the luxuries of life, we also have access to like some of the greatest theologians on, telling us their thoughts, or we have access to audio Bibles rather than just random podcasts or whatever. So there's ways to use these things in a godly way.
And I think I think that's sort of like what we're doing now. It's a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, these new creature comforts and gadgets and whatnot, they provide greater temptation. But on the other hand, they also provide new opportunities. And, this conversation, I think, is, to be humble, but this conversation
potentially part of that,
is trying to at least use this platform for something that's hopefully constructive and of spiritual benefit to people. And it doesn't have to be, like YouTube can be this, or it can be, twerk videos. You know what I mean?
Right. And I want to commend anybody who's chosen to tune in and listen to this, that even just your choice to spend, I'm not saying this was the best choice of your life.
No.
But top 10, surely.
It's not a bad one.
But yeah, as you pointed out, you could there's a lot of rubbish out on the internet, so we don't have a very high bar to clear. But I think, I feel similarly about my Bible study channel. It's like, it's an attempt. I don't know how effective it's been, but I don't know that app. Laudate. How do you say that? But so the Bible study app was an attempt to use some of the things that exist now in a positive way. You could ask the question of, overall, are these things beneficial for your life? I think it's not a useful question to ask. The question should be, how do you as an individual live best in the situation that you find yourself? because you could spend all day speculating about whether, would it be possible for the gospel to reach the four corners of the earth without modern technology? Perhaps not. It could be a very significant part of God's plan for the world. But on the other hand, it's very easy we've done a reasonably good job today of laying out some of the downsides of our modern creature comforts, but a lot more could be said on that front, right? I think it's probably Jesus's comment about the rich man that gives me the most pause for thought.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I mean, it's not. I'm not worried about sacrificing my child to Moloch or anything. That's not my issue. My issue is not being an adulterer or a rapist or a murderer or anything like that. But like what you say, the what Jesus said of the rich man, that does come to my mind, and I'm like,
it's been interesting. Multiple people in the chat. Yeah, multiple people in the chat have said that in some way God has used the lockdown in a positive way in their life. So in a strange way, although the lockdown has been trouble and disappointment for me in some ways for the church, actually I can see other ways that it's been positive. I can see spiritual growth even in myself that has been caused directly by the lockdown. We have to remember that God is greater than world events, and God doesn't require strong individual people to make his plans come about. We see this over and over again in the Old Testament, that actually it's the flawed, troubled, half-hearted efforts of his incompetent people who ends up sort of stumbling their way to victory because of God's great control over history.
No, I am into that. I guess sort of my last question to you before we wrap up here is the ultimate riding the tiger, so to speak, bending the knee to Christ and God's will?
Yeah, this is a topic I've sort of made a couple of comments on in the past. I guess most of the people familiar with your channel are also aware of riding the tiger, or is it worth giving a
you could just give them a quick rundown.
Yeah, it's an idea comes from Julius Evola, and the metaphor is that I'll explain the imagery first and then the parallel. So you have to imagine that you are somehow you've ended up on the back of a tiger who wants to get you. It's kind of thrashing around, and clearly one tactic could be, all right, I'm going to leap off this tiger, take up a stance and fight him head on. And the assumption behind the metaphor is that this is a futile effort. A tiger is an enormous muscular beast with big fangs, and you're defenseless. You haven't got a weapon to hand. That's a tactic lots of people attempted to try. It doesn't work. Much better idea is just cling on to the back of the tiger. He can't actually get you while you're there. Not going to be easy, and you're going to kind of fly around. But eventually the tiger will tire out. And your only job whilst you're in this mode of riding the tiger is like just weather the storm. You have to be paying attention and be ready. And then in the so the metaphor applies in that the tiger represents the malevolent forces in society who are in control, and the idea of fighting the tiger would be to directly oppose what is colloquially called the cathedral. I suppose it's the power structure consisting of the media, big corporations and people with connections, this kind of shady group of individuals who actually wield power in the world. So rather than trying to directly oppose them and just getting torn to shreds because they're way more powerful than you, your job is to somehow survive all of the horrible things they're going to get up to. Now, Evola wanted to come up with an approach that would be common amongst multiple religions. And there's always a hesitancy when you come across one of these comparative religion type approaches where you go, if you're reading Christianity only for the things that it has in common with other religions, you're missing everything that's important about Christianity. I would argue. So I'm going to end up saying that to some degree, yes.
But a God, we serve the God. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, but nonetheless, he's onto something, I think, in that if you are unhappy with what's going on in the world as a Christian, you still have the question of like, how should I approach this? And multiple approaches, fortunately, there's different people are going to try different things. So whichever is the most effective method, somebody's going to try it. What do I think about this particular idea? I'm generally in favor. I think he's onto something. But how do we apply that in a Christian context? Well, so what should you be doing whilst you're quote unquote riding the tiger? You should be becoming a stronger individual and forming communities and that are reinforcing of one another and things like this. Sounds an awful lot like the exhortations to form churches. It's the same stuff. So in some ways I feel like, sorry, Evola, Paul got there first.
Yeah.
Yes, I think.
And the thing, of course, with like my I have a rather similar view. I'll let you carry on first, but
no, okay,
I think Evola's like many people, right? Like many people, I think Evola's analysis of the situation is correct.
Yeah.
Of what we're living through is right, but I think he falls short in his prescriptive capacity. So the Evola, of course, was a neo-pagan and kind of a perennialist, is that? Yeah. So it's kind of a perennialist. He sort of sees tradition with a capital T and across all sorts of different cultures and religions. So he's kind of like got this bizarre pantheistic faith, which would be, kind of anathema to to sort of any sort of Christian idea, essentially. So, we as Christians would say, yes, we affirm that, morality is sort of written on the heart of man, and that different cultures, as imperfect as they are, have within their traditions some aspect of the truth. But the truth with a capital T is truth by definition is exclusive, right? So yes. you cannot all be right, essentially. Yes. And we have very good reason to believe that, Jesus Christ is who he said he is. He is Lord and Savior and Lord of the universe, and, one part of the triune God, and so on and so forth. So we can't have any truck with sort of neo-paganism in that sense. But as far as sort of recognizing where we as a society are at and sort of the crippling effect of kind of modernity and liberalism and materialism and all that sort of stuff. I think that is absolutely true. And of course, the question of sort of how we manage this situation, sort of how do we ride that tiger? How do we ride that tiger? Is I think a very important one to examine.
Yeah, I guess there's a general framing in Evola that I want to really be cautious of, which is the idea of generic spiritual strength and like the rebuilding of our society is what matters.
Yeah. What I call I'm sorry to interrupt, but what I call that aspect of Evola is it's new age for Wignets is what I call it. And it kind of is. Yeah. It's sort of vague, mushy. It's tradition, right?
Yeah.
In quotes. It's spiritual, without sort of defining what that is. It's perennial, which is a bit here, a bit there. It's the common denominator. It's the baseline for these different faiths. But
not that
it's not particularly useful or true. I mean,
not that these kind of appropriations of paganism and New Age ideas would actually be novel for Wignats, right? There's been a long association between those two groups. In some ways, we find ourselves in the trad circles in the strange situation of being considered adjacent to a lot of groups which actually represent the opposite of what we want to stand for. Like, in some ways, I mean, talking about bravery, right? You need to know who your audience is to know what's really brave to say. But like, maybe what's brave to say in this audience is, I'd rather go along with the kind of mundane. I don't know. I'd go along with Facebook and the Democrat Party before I align myself with general forces of spirituality that go against God, which is to say, I think politics is a secondary concern for me. And when you're talking about riding the tiger, there's one way of reading it, which is to say, make politics a secondary concern, in which case I could say, yes, definitely. Like, the way I want to live is to spend most of my energy on my faith and on individual spiritual improvement. But there's a potentially sinister side of, like, there's people who want to see society burn for a bad reason. There's people who want to just generally watch things falling apart.
Yeah. There is a nihilistic impulse there, I think.
Exactly. That I want to be cautious of. Maybe it's easy to we see things getting worse in the West. But things have been getting worse slowly in the West for a long time. And it could still be argued that the West is a more open and receptive place to Christianity and a more comfortable material place to live than we really realize. And even though, yes, it's getting worse, it'll eventually cross that point and it'll be worse than the average. I still think we're on the kind of slow tail, like everything recedes through entropy back to the norm, right? Where the norm is like a fairly miserable place to be. So whilst we can look back in our history as a civilization and say there's lots of things that have got worse morally, spiritually since then, that doesn't necessarily mean there aren't things to be thankful for and grateful. I suspect the Queen, as much as I criticize her, may actually be a Christian. And in her address that she gives once a year, she has, for the past few years, given what I think is an accurate... it's not something I usually bother to listen to, actually, to be honest, but she has given an accurate and faithful explanation of the fact that we are sinful and we are looking back on Jesus's death as our only route to salvation. So that's a force for good in our country that a lot of other places don't have.
No, I think that's a good point you brought up. And
sorry, it was slightly off topic from Ride the Tiger, wasn't it? Never mind.
Oh, no, it's all right. It's all good, man. I mean, it's a conversation between two guys.
You gave me a prompt, and I then sort of drifted.
It's good, man. Yeah, I think, but I think sort of what you're getting at is generally right. Like that impulse to sort of, like I saw that more in kind of the, if we're looking at sort of historical movements, the National Socialists in Germany, I think, sort of had a bit more of that nihilistic impulse than like what you would find in Italy at the same time. Right. There's a hatred of the world as it exists, and a desire to sort of kind of tear down and destroy. And like, there are certain things I hate about the world too, but I don't really I don't want to destroy the world so much as redeem the world, if that sort of makes sense. And and to do that, to sort of save the world, certain things are going to have to be knocked down and destroyed. Maybe certain practices are going to have to be discouraged. Maybe certain economic models are going to have to be reevaluated and, adapted or dynamited or whatever. I think all that's correct, but I think the how best riding the tiger, how do you do that? If you look at, I think sort of the great saints in history, they should be the model. Spiritual, being in spiritual communion with the one true God, I think, is ultimately the best thing that you can do now or at any time. And if you do that, if you do sort of submit, and I'm not saying I've done this entirely myself, so if for everyone in the audience being like, oh, don't worry about me. But this is something aspirational for all of us. But if you do sort of submit to the Lord, and with the gifts and capacity you are endowed with, are willing to be used and are open to it, and are open to being used by God for his purposes, great things can happen. Now, how that plays out in your own life, I can't say. How that plays out in my own life, I don't even know, right? Because I haven't done that fully yet. But I think making that sort of your primary purpose will open up a whole lot of opportunities that as yet we cannot foresee.
You have to disentangle the visible result from the rightness of the action, I think. So it's possible. So, for example, suppose you were to live the rest of your life from this moment in perfect obedience to God in every area of your life, great and small, observing tiny thoughts that you had and keeping everything in line to the best of your ability, right? Yeah. And you just saw the world around you spiraling out of control. You never saw a single person that you talked to take any interest in Christianity, but you faithfully carried on taking opportunities as they arrived to speak, and whatever it took. Just nothing happened. But somebody was watching you from afar who you didn't even know, and that person was inspired and converted because of your life, and then they went on and had an enormous effect on the world, an enormous positive effect, but after you had died, right? you would never know for your entire life that what you were doing was so significant in God's plan for the universe. So that's just a sort of hypothetical to indicate, right? We can be used in our faithfulness by God, even if we don't ever see the fruits of it. So you should be totally encouraged in your life if you've been faithful, regardless of the effect that it's having, I guess. So that's the one way in which I think riding the tiger applies as a Christian, is you don't fight the tiger, you live your life faithfully. And unlike Evola, we have a great ultimate certainty of victory. So, and in another way, that's why riding the tiger is not a good metaphor, because you could fall off at any moment, or after you fall off, the tiger could wake up and still maul you to death. But you're like,
or Jesus could come again while you're still on the tiger's back.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we want to advocate. I don't think there is a good metaphor, because outside of God, there's no such thing as certainty. But the point is that we should be more encouraged in our daily lives, and if we're prayerful and ask God for how we should live. I'm not saying it'll never be the case that we need to take direct action or face some clear hostility and face on, and it could even, could lead to violence in some form. I highly doubt that, especially if YouTube is listening. But the point is, God will make it clear. The basic requirements of living a faithful life are the same for if you're living in the challenge of current day England, where things are materially good and you're mostly not persecuted directly, or if you're living in a country which is potentially threatening to execute you for your faith. The requirement is that you're in a relationship with God. You want to hear what he says. You pray, you read Bible passages, you find challenging things, about the way we're asked to live, and you meditate upon them, and you say, how can I apply these in my life? There will be examples of people's lives in the Bible that match up with your current life.
No, I think that's a very good point. And if you sort of pair this to what we're talking about, and I guess this will just sort of be my my last thing as we sort of end off here. But if you pair what we're talking about right now with sort of what we were talking about earlier, with sort of as persecution or the world gets more dark, the Christians that are going to be standing left are going to be the ones who sort of fervently believe the faith and whatnot. They're the ones who are sort of building communities. They're the ones who are sort of maintaining and holding on to sort of the social bonds that they have. They're the ones who are bettering themselves. They're the ones who are trying to be servants of the Lord. You could say, on the back end of when the tiger finally gets tuckered out and whatnot, they will be the ones to sort of, from such people, maybe the Lord will raise his champion. From such people, maybe we'll have an opportunity to sort of rebuild something that we can be proud of again. And I guess that's all I have to say.
Jesus said to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church," meaning Peter. At that point, Christianity was about, well, at one point it shrank down and there was basically nobody left. It was like Jesus had been abandoned by everybody, pretty much. It was a handful. It then grew to the size that it is today from that size. So even if things shrink down again and the church ends up as a literal handful of people, what's the problem? So I think you can never be a Christian and be ultimately pessimistic. People were saying, is this stream going to be depressing? We've talked about some negative trends, but let's remember the church worldwide is growing, and within both of our countries there are still faithful Christians preaching God's word. There's more than enough raw material for God to work with, and if you individually as a listener are a Christian, if you've devoted your life to him, how can you ever be depressed? You've had the most wonderful gift, and nothing's ever going to stop God from working those, those things that have started in your life to conclusion. The trends are all good within you.
Yes, and if you're like Visigoth, these bad times may have been just the opportunity you needed to put you on the right track. So there is that.
I wouldn't be afraid to say praise God for the terrible lockdowns. If that's your personal testimony, then amazing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Lambda, as we're wrapping up here, do you have anything you want to plug?
Why not go and subscribe to my Bible study channel? Hey, yes. All it will give you is more Mr. Patriarch, which clearly you already like if you're if you're subbed here. Oh, by the way, I didn't realize you'd reached your 1K. Congratulations, man!
Oh, thank you.
Well done. Does that mean people can super chat now?
I made it. Yeah, I just got to get my my viewing.
How far off are you?
You got to get the 1,000 subs, and you need the 4,000 watch hours within one calendar year. So I'm still working on that, but I should hit that in hopefully a month or two, particularly if these streams help out a bit. But no, thanks, man. It's
cool. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. And if anyone, again, I reiterate, please go subscribe to Lambda Bible Studies, link down in the description. And if you are new here, please subscribe to this channel as well. If you managed to stick with us for this almost, 2.5 hours, time went by.
It's flown.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. And Patriarch out.
Good night.